Hey guys, this is Brian Craig, and I'm going to share a video today. It's the raw recording of a podcast interview I recorded with the podcast Spake Makers. I grew up and my whole life have spent in a fellowship of churches called the International Churches of Christ. I actually work for one of those churches as my job, and I've spent my whole adult life in these churches, and so super familiar and care a lot about our churches and what the needs are and the challenges are and the opportunities are. And anyway, this podcast, Spake Makers, is a few young people kind of spread across the globe that are a part of this family of churches, much younger than me, but have put this podcast together. They're saying that they want to make space for intergenerational and hard conversations about controversial topics. And so they invited me on as a guest because I'm old and grew up in the church and wanted to hear just sort of what I thought about different things. And we ended up kind of talking about all kinds of things. Generational challenges, of course, since that's kind of the topic of the podcast. But I share what I appreciate about young people in general, young people in our churches. But we ended up talking about culture and engaging culture and the challenges of that, the challenges of COVID and isolation and different stuff about our church. Some things I might share that, they kind of got me talking, so I might share some things that are controversial. So if you disagree, I would love to hear from you and even have dialogue about it. But I talked a little bit about what I consider some bad scriptural interpretation maybe in our past, but also real positives about our church and our history. But just some of the reactionary dynamics that happen with churches over time. And when I was young in our family of churches, all the conversation was about one generation and winning the world in one generation, what we were trying to do in one generation. And that has really expanded to be really, it's important that we build a church that's for all generations and that's multi-generational, and that we're passing on our faith, and that our churches are raising up young ministers, and new people are taking on the mantle of leadership. And so we talk about a lot of that, and faith versus fear when it comes to building our churches. Talk a little bit about social media and some of what I feel like are my shortcomings with that, and I really want to learn from some of the young people even with some of these new platforms for communication and new opportunities for the gospel to be communicated. And we talk a little bit about worship ministry there at the end. So it's an hour-and-a-half interview, but if you have some time and you'd like to listen to a lot of my rantings and ramblings, I'd love you to enjoy this podcast interview with Spake Makers.
This is so exciting. I'm so excited to have you on here. Been singing songs that you've written since I was born, probably. So it's pretty exciting to be on the Zoom call with you and to be able to hear more about you as a person, which is exciting. I know that you and Megan already know each other because you guys work on the same staff team. Megan, what's your position on, or how do you guys work together officially?
I'm like a social media person, and
Cool.
then he leads the South congregation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But Megan's new to our group. She was always in the West Side, which is a kind of a sister congregation. So LA Church is like a collection of all these. It's not really. I mean, when people think of LA Church, a lot of times they think of one congregation, but we went for like a decade without even meeting together, all of us. So it's really kind of more of a family of churches. And so Megan grew up in one of the other kind of sister congregations, but was able to watch her grow up. And her mom does HR for the LA Church.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good stuff.
And her dad and I used to have lots of conversations about you 2 years ago, as I recall.
Love it.
Love.
Love it. Okay, so I guess we can just go ahead and dive right in. So this is kind of the conclusion of our 3-part Kingdom Kid experience series. We did the two-parter with different Kingdom kids sharing their experiences. We did the one with their parents, and then this one, which I think will be really interesting because JBC, or do you want me to call you JBC? In my head, you're JBC, but I realize that's kind of weird. So Brian's probably
Yeah, just call me
like
Brian. Yeah,
normal.
it's funny. All these, my own kids call me J. Brian Craig just to be silly, because,
That's hilarious.
but yeah, I mean, the only reason I used that was because, so like when I first started doing music, briancraig.com was taken and was
That's
like,
funny.
an African American real estate agent in Georgia or something.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, Michael J. Fox, or, like E. Sherwin
That's
McIntosh.
funny.
I just used my first initial because my parents always call me by my middle name. So that's why I
What does
always,
the J stand for then?
James. Yeah.
James. So,
Yeah.
but people call you Brian, and I will
Everybody
call
call
you
me Brian. Yeah.
Brian,
So feel free to
like
call
you're
me
a normal
Brian.
person or whatever.
Yeah. It's funny
Yeah,
though. I just came from 2 weeks of camp. So these
right.
counselors and gophers would call me Jay Brian. Hey, Jay Brian.
Hey, J. Brian. That's funny.
I
That's
just,
hilarious.
amen.
Yeah.
Cool.
So Brian. So the cool thing about you is that you were a Kingdom kid and then now you are raising Kingdom kids or have finished raising them. I'm not sure how old they are.
Uh-huh.
Are they kind of out of the nest by this point? Or you're kind of done? Or...
They're all still in the nest. My middle kid is about to go off to college. He
Oh, okay.
did college last year, but he did it remotely. So, but yeah, the kids
Cool.
are 22, 20, and almost 17. So,
Oh, all right.
yeah.
So, okay, cool. So I guess, yeah, just opening up that first question is, how was your experience as a Kingdom kid? Just looking back.
Well, it's kind of unique because I mean, we didn't use that term then, and there wasn't very many of us. So, I know, I've listened to your first podcast, and then the ones with Gordon. I haven't been able to listen to the Kingdom Kids one yet, but it's really great. By the way, you're doing an awesome job. I love your podcast, and I think it's a big need as well. So I really appreciate you guys stepping out and doing it. And I love having these kinds of conversations. I have a lot of them.
Appreciate it.
I have a lot of long talks with young people and stuff. And I
Love
also
it.
spent, starting in 2016, I've been taking master's classes at Pepperdine in class. So all the students I'm with are like in their early 20s. And so, I just finished, but for 4 or 5 years, I was in class with people in their early 20s. So forgive me if I accidentally say kids or something, when I'm referring to people of that age group.
You're
Because
good.
my father-in-law still calls me and Dessa kids. So I think it's just a dad thing.
Yeah,
I don't mean any disrespect. I definitely
we get it.
consider you adults. But anyway, I think it's a really valuable podcast. But our church, so my experience, my family is both my parents are Church of Christ, many, many generations, like at least
Right.
nine generations that we know of.
Whoa.
And even on my dad's side, his mom's side, going back to Alexander Campbell, like to that Bethany, Georgia,
Oh, wow.
was so it's very like Church of Christ. So
Yeah.
I grew up, we would go on vacation, we go to these kind of mainline churches of Christ, but then my parents got involved with what's kind of known as the campus ministry movement when that started in the early 70s.
Right.
And we were in Florida. I was born in Florida in 71. So I'm just turned 50, which is so old, you guys. I feel like, how can I be 50? Like, that's crazy. But anyway, so I was born in 71, and then my dad went in the ministry not much longer after that, I think probably mid 70s, and got involved with Crossroads, which was, I think you guys have probably talked about. I think I heard Gordon talk about it a little bit. And what Crossroads was doing was training campus ministers and then sending them out to these mainline Church of Christ congregations. And somebody made a comment on the podcast that 30 years ago or however many years ago we kind of didn't agree with what was going on, so we started our own thing. And that's kind of that's sort of true in a way, but sort of not true in another way. so within the Church of Christ, and forgive me because I really get into this stuff. So if I'm going way too off, just
You're good. No, church history
redirect
is
me.
so important. It's
Just
so
redirect
important.
me. But I think so. Church history is full of all kinds of this happens and then we correct for it, right? This happens and then we
Right.
correct for it. And I
Yeah.
think what we always want to be doing is well, what is the Spirit doing? How is He working? How is He moving? And like, let's align ourselves with Him. Let's align ourselves with that. Like what does
Mhm.
God want us to do? So I feel like that's really true of even right now. And I can talk more about that later. But so
Mhm.
I feel like God was doing that in the 60s and early 70s where there was a lot of student activism. There was a lot of, it was a kind of crazy time in our country and in our world, but God
Mhm.
was doing something. And so there was a real youth movement in our country, and there was a real desire to see change. And
Right.
Gordon kind of spoke to this a little bit, but so these within the churches of Christ, the sort of, first of all, there wasn't like there was one unified thing that we left. The Church of Christ is a unity movement in that it was founded on the idea of let's just all be Christians. So let's like one of their slogans was Christians only, but not the only Christians.
Mhm.
Meaning, let's get rid of the creeds and all this structure and all this kind of stuff. Let's just be Christians. And so they were very anti-structure. In fact, really early on, and the Church of Christ is actually the first denomination. They wouldn't want to be called a denomination, but they're the first, religious organization or denomination in the new America. So they were the very first new strain of Christianity in America, like in the early 1800s. So, and the idea was let's, and they were, so it was a kind of overcorrection, but they were very anti-structure because they were coming out of Presbyterian church that was very structured and had like a real hierarchical kind of thing to it. And so they were like, we don't want any structure because we don't see that in the Bible. And so we just want to be just Christians. And so there was just all these congregations that are autonomous, and they were held together loosely by these publications and by like conferences and by like mission societies. There were some people that thought even mission societies aren't biblical because that's structure. We shouldn't have even mission societies and stuff. So it was very anti-structure. So when when we're sending campus ministers to these different churches, it's not like this big unified effort or something, or it's just kind of this organic, just kind of happening, right? But what
Mhm.
would happen in these congregations is you had the older people that were sort of, they're not evangelistic. They're not involved in each other's lives. They're very, it's kind of a dead faith in a lot of ways. I'm not saying all, because they're
Mhm.
autonomous congregations, so each one is different. But and then these campus students who are like on fire for Jesus because they're kind of part of this sort of Jesus movement time period. And so there was a cultural clash. And so a lot of those churches were either splitting or,
Right.
it wasn't really working well. And so
Mhm.
we went to a church when I was 7 that was one of those types of churches where a campus minister had been trained in Crossroads in Pueblo, Colorado. He was trained in Crossroads and then went to Pueblo, Colorado. And then all
Mhm.
these students started becoming Christians, and the church split, and the main minister left because of these kind of cultural clashes. And
Mm.
so we went there for my dad to be the pulpit minister, the kind of main minister. So I share all that to say, I consider myself a kingdom kid because I grew up in kind of the development of the ICOC, and
Right.
it even split in my own family. Like, whereas some of my parents' siblings went with the stream of what became was the Crossroads movement and the Boston movement and the ICOC, and others
Mhm.
didn't, or my grandparents were with the Boston movement and then they split out. And so I kind of watched all of this happen. Right. But I
Right.
was growing up in it, but it made a huge impact. I mean, I loved it because I was able to see just this, I saw a big difference between kind of the older, kind of more stale version of Christianity I saw in some of these kind of older, kind of traditional churches, and then these
Mm.
campus ministry churches, or these churches where like in Pueblo, where they were baptizing like 100 people a year, and these campus students were just on fire and all that. So that had a big impact on me as a young person. But my parents both were very active. They were in the ministry. We moved for the ministry, for them to do that. And then we moved to Denver when I was in high school to be a part of what we call the discipling movement church. So kind of the campus ministries became these. So what happened in Boston was you had another situation like I'm describing, where you have a campus minister who comes in, and then there's cultural issues, and then the church kind of splits. And so they were left with just who still wants to be here. And and it really worked, because if in the South Bay church today we said, okay, we're going to have a meeting this weekend, nobody's in our church until you agree to like be sold out for Jesus, and like if you are totally sold out, then you can be here, and everybody else, like if we sort of artificially prune the church down to like just the people that are sold out for Jesus, that church would be on fire. But that's not a way to build for the long term, or multi-generational, or in 20 years you're going to be back to how do you keep older Christians motivated, and how do you know what I mean? So anyway, but I think the idea of disciples only, I mean, it's a good idea. I mean, and it's biblical in that Jesus definitely has some demands of what it means to be a disciple, but I think it's up to God to determine who's a disciple and who's not. And like, anyway, that's another topic, but so what happened in Boston was that church was exploding. And so a lot of churches were aligning themselves with Boston, and it became very, very structural. So the structure that we had was a reaction to, just like the Church of Christ was their anti-structure, in my view, was a reaction to the Presbyterian church those ministers came out of. Our overstructure, or probably too much structure, in my opinion, was an overreaction to the lack of structure in the Church of Christ.
Right.
And so, but anyway, that's kind of off topic of what it means to be a kingdom kid. But because of that, the church was really young. So that's what I was trying to get to. So like there was only a few families that had kids my age, like the Brumleys and the Lambs and the Mannels. And so there's not many of us. So when, I was like at my campus ministry, I was the only person who had grown up in the church, whereas now it might be mostly in the campus ministry kids that grew up in the church. So it's very different now. But I totally loved growing up in the church. I'm so, my parents, faith, they weren't perfect. They modeled just living it, right? Dealing with their sin, having relationships, inviting people into their life and into their marriage, wrestling through issues. Both my sisters became Christians and married Christians, and are still in the church. And my dad's an elder in the church in New York. And so I'm so grateful to have grown up in the church, and it really made a huge impact. I mean, it's like my whole life, it's everything to me. But anyway, that's a long answer that went all over the place.
No, you're good. Kind of a follow-up question. Was there anything that was kind of hard about that type of upbringing? Anything you look back on?
I think, my experience was good. I think there was hard things that happened in the church, more like in probably my college years and early years of ministry. I think our church, the activism, the evangelistic zeal, the international idea, all of that was good. I think, and God's Spirit was working. And so I really think, like when I look at our church, and I feel like this is the spirit of you guys and of your podcast, is like, I'm really grateful for our church. I love our church. I love the international aspect of it. I love what God has done through it. And I'm prayerful for it. I think, but we did some things that were sinful, and we had some cultural, there was some cultural stuff in the water that was a bad hermeneutic. It was a bad interpretation of
Right.
scripture.
Yeah.
I could get into if you want me to, but that led us to some things that were not good. But I don't think
Yeah.
those causal early on. I don't think that was a big cultural problem, but then I think it became a cultural problem. So I
Yeah.
experienced things more later, I think, in college or as a young minister that were like bad, like that were, I would consider almost abusive,
Mm,
that were, but the way I processed that stuff was, I still think God's here. I think, there were, things that happened bad in the first century. There was things, I think of Peter
right.
in Antioch, dissing the Gentiles because his Jewish buddies showed up. That's really bad, but
Right.
but God still used Peter, and God used Paul in Peter's life. And, so God is bigger than all of it, is the way I processed it. And I'm not gonna, I still think, that I still believe in what we're doing. I still believe God and how
Mhm.
God's Spirit is leading. And I think God disciplined us. And God still needs to discipline us. But we had, some sinful practices or some sinful cultural things,
Right.
that I
Yeah.
experienced, for sure. I mean, not as much as maybe some people, because I was usually around pretty awesome people, and, in the church, that pretty mature. But I definitely experienced some stuff that I would say, like, that's not cool. We shouldn't. That was really bad.
Right. Right.
As
Um,
far as like motivating, the way that we motivated people, just to give
right.
people don't know context, but
Right.
using sales techniques to motivate people, or
Mm,
shaming people, or
yeah.
using a group, that kind of a group thing to publicly shame someone. Just things
Mhm.
that were like, I don't know how that happened, and it was bad that it happened.
Right.
You know.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. What you're saying is getting me thinking, because I mean, here at Space Makers, we talk a lot about, wanting change or calling for change or bridging gaps. And I think it's interesting that we talk a lot about church history on this podcast. It just kind of, we never really set out to do it, but it kind of happens in every episode because I think it it's so important to see where we've come from to understand what's going on right now. Because I think a lot of people, if they think of, oh no, like young people are thinking differently, or if they think of, oh no, like people are saying things that they don't like about the church, or they want to change things, like it can kind of freak some people out.
Yeah.
And the thing is with that, it's like, I think it will freak you out if you don't remember where we come from. And like,
Right.
I guess for you, since you've been around and your family has been around for so long, what I guess how do you make sense, or how do you see all of those changes, and how do you make sense of it in your mind that like, wow, we change a lot, we mess up a lot, and I guess like, yeah, how do you process that? How does that not freak you out that like, oh, this whole thing is messed up. Maybe it's just the
Yeah.
system. And, I don't know if that makes sense, but I guess how are you thinking through the fact that church goes through so many changes and makes so many mistakes? And how do you see that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think for me, it's staying centered in Jesus and his teaching and his method,
Right.
and 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 really believing that there is, I mean, I he uh there the things that the ideas of being a disciple and making disciples, and following Jesus, and being willing to give my life for the cause, and having other people in my life, and all the one another passages, all that is good and right. And I feel like we have had a great, like, overall, I mean, I think God has really done great things in our churches, in those things. And I think, but Hebrews 12 says God disciplines those he loves, and endure hardship is discipline. God is treating you as sons. And I feel like God has disciplined us for areas that we didn't. When I see that things were wrong, it was always that we were not following the way of Jesus. So,
Mm,
like, when I talk about a bad hermeneutic, like, a scripture that used to be used a lot was Matthew 11, the kingdom of God has been forcefully advancing since the days of John, and forceful men lay hold of it. And so the kingdom is forcefully advancing, and we need to be forceful men. Like, we need to aspire to be forceful, and we have to, it's kind of like we have to force and do this thing, and we got to win the world in one generation. And so there was this this model of, okay, what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be like, you know, a minister in our churches, to be a forceful evangelist, to like make people do the right thing. And that's just a horrible hermeneutic. It's not at all, that's not at all what that text says. Like, it the forceful men are the enemies who are persecuting the church. The church suffer, and they've even changed the newer NIV translation. You know, the kingdom is forcefully advancing, meaning like, in spite of forceful people, in spite of persecution, it's through the persecution that God works. And so, like, for example, I think even the time that we're in right now, where we're having conflict in our country and maybe even in our church, like, people are afraid of that. But I think that's where God works. God works through those types of he always is working in that stuff. Like, if you hadn't had the conflict, if you hadn't had the conflict over so you have the Hebraic Jews and the Hebrew Jews, and I mean, that's a racial issue where certain parts of the church are being overlooked, but because of that problem, and that problem is bad, but you have these young leaders raise up to take that on in the church. And then God uses those young leaders, and one of those young leaders is Stephen, and then Stephen is this awesome guy, but Stephen is persecuted and killed, and then along with that is all this other persecution. But if you hadn't had that persecution, then you wouldn't had all the disciples get scattered out of Jerusalem, and then they end up in Antioch, and we don't even know who they are that start the church in Antioch. But if you didn't have Antioch, you wouldn't have had this Christian movement. I think, like, you wouldn't have had Paul for sure, because Antioch was critical to Paul and a base of his ministry, and he would have never become Paul if he hadn't been for Antioch. You know, so anyway, like, I think we always got to be looking at how is God working even in the difficult stuff, and what is His Spirit doing. So I think that's where what you guys are doing, and the voice of young people is so important. Like, I've been at some of our conferences where there'll be a talk on postmodernism, for example, and it's a very like defensive talk. It's like, here are all the things that are bad about postmodernism, and here's what our kids are reading or learning, or, you know, Rob Bell, or, you know, all these scary things. And it's like, we have to be scared. But it's like, well, that's not a solution. Like we're in postmodernism. So what is the Spirit doing now? Like, to me, it's like, well, there's whereas before, even all of our social structures were like a top down, a command and control structure base. But now it's like, that's not the way even companies work. You know, it's very like, there's a democratization of information. There's a lot of, there's a really, you know, a lot of leveling out, and people have to figure out for themselves what the truth is. And you know, and prayerfully, the truth does rise to the top, and truth is truth wherever you find it. And so God's going to be working through that. But so how do we respond to postmodernism? We have to like not run from it, but like lean into it. And so what does it mean to be a Christian in this space? So I think the church is always we operate in a cultural space. So we always have to be going, what is the culture, and how do I engage that culture without losing, again, Jesus, discipleship, what a Christian ethic looks like, what it means to be Jesus. So I think as a church, we were guilty of neglecting love and mercy and tenderness and compassion, and like kindness was not an ethic was not a staff ethic in the early 90s, in my opinion. You know, it was forceful men. That's the ethic. And that's not a Christian ethic. That's not a Jesus ethic. In fact, Jesus says, don't be like the Gentiles who lord it over other people. You know, that's exactly the opposite of what you need to be. If you're a servant, if you're a leader, you need to be a slave of all. You need to be the one who's making the sacrifices yourself. You need to be serving, you know, that's the Christian ethic, is the way of Jesus. And it's a lot more difficult than just I have all the answers and I'm going to tell everybody what to do and you need to do it. Like that's a shortcut. That's not the Jesus way. The Jesus way is always harder. But anyway, so the short answer, I know I give long-winded answers, but the short
No, you're
answer is
good.
I think every time we've gotten off track, it's because we're not doing the way of Jesus. And as long as we
Mhm.
keep repenting and going back to Jesus, and how are we not like Jesus? And how do we need to
Mm.
be more like Jesus? God's going to keep working through us. And so I have a lot of hope. I think looking at other, at church history helps me to not freak out. Looking at the Bible helps me to not freak out.
Yeah,
So
right. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I mean, our whole podcast is all about just kind of bridging that gap and making sure that we're looking at culture and trying to see, what Jesus is trying to do within the culture, not fight the culture. And I love what you said about, kind of not being scared of,
yeah,
um, I don't know. I wish, I know that it's funny because I know that not everyone will even listen to this podcast because of fear of what we're going to say. And I
mhm,
wish I could just tell everybody like, hey, you don't have to be scared of us. Like,
yeah,
why are, like it's not scary. We're just trying to figure it out like you. And, we might say some kind of new things, but we want to talk with you. And we definitely don't want to just be like, I don't know, these like scary kids who are saying these crazy things. And, I just hope people don't, don't, I guess, like take that from who we are. But,
yeah.
you know,
Well, it is scary. I mean, anything uncertain is scary, right?
right,
And
right.
I think having to trust God. So throughout the Bible, there's always trust God, but it's going to be scary, and you don't know where He's leading you, and you
Mm-hmm.
don't know, and you're not going to agree with how He does it sometimes, and He's
Yeah.
not going to show you. He might show you step one, but He's not going to show you step two or three. Like
Mm,
that is, that's always the way of faith. And then the easier
right.
way is okay, I want horses, I want chariots, okay, I'm going to make this agreement with Egypt. Okay, I'm going to make this agreement with Babylon. Like what we want to trust in, what we can see and what we can control. And
Mm-hmm.
and so we have to recognize that tendency. And so I know like it's easier to like, I think our faith became in ourselves, like in our structure, in we're the fastest growing church, or in who we are, and like in our leaders, instead of in God and His Spirit. And you know what I mean? Like, so I think God is always going to challenge that, because our faith is always has to. So there's always going to be some new thing that we want to put our trust in, and it might be something else we can see or touch or taste or handle. And we have to resist that and go, no, I have to keep putting my trust back in God. And it's scary. And I don't. So I pray that, I pray every day the Lord's Prayer. And part of the Lord's Prayer is, you know, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Here it's your will, it's your kingdom. So, and we've been in the ministry for 21 years now. And, and as mentioned, I'm 50 now, but I still pray like, God, I'm just here at your, I serve at the pleasure of the King. Like, just use me however you want to use me. And I don't want to like try to, because I get it, you want to try to control. I want security. I want to, I want to be able to have an outcome that I can predict, a predictable outcome. And you can't. Like, God is always going to frustrate that, because we have to depend on Him. We have to depend on His Spirit. We have to operate by faith, you know. So
Wow.
anyway, but I see where the fear comes from. So I guess it helps to go, okay. And when people are afraid, that's when they tend to be a little angry, maybe, or like
Right.
have teeth to what they're
Yeah.
saying. Because, and I myself included, like I recognize when I get angry, I usually go, it's because I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what might
Mm,
happen, or I'm afraid
right.
of
Right. Yeah. Well, and a few of our friends and I, like, we were talking on Zoom, and we were just kind of the space makers and a few of our friends, and we were talking about how, like, we know that when we're in the older generation, like, we hope that we will also extend that same courage to listen to the younger, because we know we're going to have to let go of some stuff that we fought for when we were young. And
Yeah.
it's just, and I think that's why it's cool to even have this conversation with you, because you've kind of seen the cycles. And so we're hoping that, I hope when I'm 50, I will look at the 25-year-old and be like, hey, like, I want to hear what's going on in your world. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
but that's kind of what we talked about with Gordon too, that he was like, I set out to not be that old person that shuts down the young people. I want to be the old person who listens and learns from the young people. And now he is. And so,
Yeah.
we hope that we can be that when we're Gordon's age too.
Amen. Yeah, I do too. I really have a lot of optimism and excitement about the younger generation in our churches. And it is a unique challenge that because our church, again, we didn't have older people in our church when I was so I was like the only teen in my teen ministry at the beginning, and me and my younger sisters, and then some other families kind of come around, but so we never kind of handed off the church to the next generation. And the people, like Gordon said on his podcast, you guys, the guys who were sort of making the decisions, they aged, but they kind of kept making the decisions. So there's the ministers my age, there's not actually many of us, because like I was 30 when a lot of the crisis was or early 30s when a lot of the crisis was happening in the church. And so other ministers my age we were the ones that were let go or quit or whatever. So we never the torch was never really handed to us. So now it's like, but now the guys are too old. So now it's like, okay, now it's being handed to the 30-year-olds, or the people who are kind of a generation behind us.
Yeah.
And we haven't done this before. And so there's going to be challenges with that. But that's so important that happens. It's so important that the young people get empowered. And I've been, frankly, really impressed by the patience of younger ministers in our churches, and the long suffering, because like what Gordon said was true. Like these other guys, the guys at the beginning of our movement, they had way more responsibility at a younger age. But I think because of there was a rejection of our movement by the older people in the mainline churches of Christ, because we were kind of overly structured and overly exclusive and some of the stuff, but their criticism would have helped us. So we would have benefited from a lot of what the older people were saying, but we didn't, and so that's where a lot of those, I think the bad hermeneutic or the things that were not like Jesus, those were critiques from the older people at the time, but but we kind of labeled it persecution, and there probably was persecution as well, but so I don't want to see that happen again. I want to see and I really appreciate the young people being willing to kind of, let's hold this together as we transition and younger people take over,
Yeah.
So it's
Wow.
important stuff.
Yeah. I'm so interested because you talked about how there's not a whole lot of people your age and a bit younger in the ICOC church still. I think we've kind of coined it as the lost generation. Even on our podcast, there's 28% are between 18 and 22. Then there's another percentage in the 20s of the 22 to 28. And then 35 to 45 is so much lower. And I think that's purely because there aren't very many people or ministers in the 30 to 45, 50 range. And
we have even more 50, 60-year-old listeners than we do in the 30.
Yeah. We have more even older people than we do for that group of people. And you're kind of the first generation Kingdom kid. And then there's this second generation, this third generation. I would categorize me and Isabel kind of in the fourth little decade of Kingdom kids. So I was wondering if you had any insight of, obviously, it can be just your opinion or something that you've looked into and stuff like that. No worries about, how sure you are, but just in your opinion, what do you think happened? Like, was it that cultural clash? Was there just not space for them? I'm so interested in what you think.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not in the best position to answer because we haven't like moved around a lot. We moved here to LA when I was 21, and then we've been in the same group this whole time. And so like my experience was I was kind of the only I was the only kingdom kid, quote unquote. Well, we didn't really call it that then, but I was the only person who grew up in the church in my campus ministry. And so there wasn't very many of us, just a few, like that would have been true of like Matt Brumley or Jeff Mantle or whoever it was that was my age. But then there was a lot of kids that were like my leaders' kids. So like the kind of generation right above us, there was a lot of those kids that became Christians. And those kids, well, first of all, I feel like the people who grew up in the church stuck around. It was more of the people who came from the outside world that maybe didn't last or didn't make it long term. And whereas people who grew up in the church, it's my experience, those were more the ones that did well. Like I'm just thinking about like the families that were in my area, like the Brain Gardeners or the Mains or the Kramers or the Plymels or the Brito's, or these are kids who are still around, or they became even in the ministry. A lot of them are doing great. They're the ones that I like, okay, you guys need to be leading the church now, Jake Rock and what. So like, so my experience has been the people in the church have done okay, but I think that lost generation comes from what I think that might be true because there's not many ministers that were younger, but I think what happened in 2003 and those years there, for a while, there was a total lack of investment in young people in campus ministry. I think everything, God judged us. I think we had become humanistic again, in my view, and I take responsibility for that. Like it was our sins. And so, but then we just sort of maintained. And so then we lost any kind of campus outreach for a while. It took us a while, maybe a decade even, to kind of get the campus stuff rolling again. And so then, and campus is such a great, it's not that people can't become Christians at other times in life, but there's just something about being college age that, you're figuring life out. It's just a great time to become a Christian. I think that's why Jesus maybe chose guys that were like that age group, right? The kind of early 20s age group, because that's just a good age to like kind of make these kinds of decisions. So because we weren't investing in that as a family of churches, I think we didn't have people that age become Christians. And so now 30 years later or whatever, that's why we don't have many people that age group. I think it's more of a lack of investment back then, because it's a little harder to have a lot of people in their 40s become Christians. I mean, I think it can happen, but especially our model is more like, it's kind of still, because that's how it was built, it's still kind of a campus ministry model. Right. I think we're learning how to reach families better, or and again, people in their 40s become Christians, but there's something
always
special
been
about
kind
that
of
age.
ICOC's main way of growth. So that makes a lot of sense looking at the history. So switching gears here a little bit. So now that you are a parent of quote unquote kingdom kids, and they probably were called kingdom kids because of where they were raised. How did your upbringing shape the way that you decided to raise your kids in the church?
We did family devotionals. We tried to, I tried to have special times with each of the kids, because those are things that my parents did. We tried to always be really genuine and authentic and not like, kind of act like we're perfect all the time. Like we tried to be real with like when we were having a bad day or having a challenge, or, when we messed up, try to, tell the kids about it or whatever. So we tried to just really, because that's what I saw in my parents, was a real authenticity.
Awesome.
So I think that helped. I think definitely also transitioning into, becoming, more of a friendship,
Yeah.
more of a counselor, more of like not even a coach, but like a, you know, advisor rather than I'm just going to tell you everything you need. Like we really wanted our
Right.
kids to have the tools to make their own decisions and try to empower them to do that as much as possible. But we're still kind of in that. But I love the where we are with each of our kids, and that they're real friendships. They're not like I'm the dad and you're the kid and you better do it because I said so. It's like it's very much a friendship. It's very much a
Yeah.
two-way street. And I think we had that. I had that with my parents, and so we tried to kind of do the same thing with our kids.
That's cool. Um, do you see any differences between kind of your quote unquote kingdom kid experience and your kids or the people their age? I know that you said you talk to a lot of young people. So you see any differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think the culture has changed. Our church culture has changed.
Mm,
I think uh, when I was growing up and in the church, it's like if you wanted to learn something or how to do something or you wanted training, it came from the older people in your life. It came from discipling and mentoring and like how
right.
to have a great marriage or how to parenting or and we always had these older couples in our life. It's funny because we kind of, like I was saying about kind of we've been in the same place for a long time since I was 21. So we always had these older families. And so we were always kind of the young ones. Like we were always, we always had this. And then all of a sudden, like we kind of flipped the switch and it's like all of a sudden we're like in our 40s, and we're like, wait, we never got to be like, we never got to like be the normal people. Like all of a sudden now we're the old people. And it's like, we never got to be like the normal people or whatever but so I always like kind of whereas now like kids have access to like starting with my oldest, he's 22, like he's the first generation to grow up with smartphones and stuff. So it's like our
Right.
kids have access to all of human knowledge at any moment. And
Mm,
so that's a whole cultural shift. That's a whole new thing.
yeah.
So whereas I had to like learn from older people things, my kids can learn that from YouTube or from, they can just do their own, they have access to all of that information. So it's a different kind of
Mm,
dynamic that was new, and so
yeah.
it shifts. I think it does shift the conversation between like what you guys are doing, like the bridging the gap stuff, because it's a new relationship. And I think older people can feel like, what are we here for then? Because the younger people are like, we don't really need you because
Mm,
we can get like, why should I learn about parenting from you when I can hear
mm,
from this expert, who's the best of the best on YouTube or whatever. Like,
right.
so, and I'm not saying that's what all young people are saying, but I think the dynamic has changed even in
No,
our
yeah.
culture, where it's like, I think every other human culture and history, it's like the wisdom is found in the elders, and
Hmm.
that's kind of the source of knowledge for your community. That's not
Right.
that's not the case anymore. You have access to the wisdom of all of
Right.
humanity now. So um
Right.
so that's definitely different. Like my son Marshall, who he just got baptized in May, I would kind of think we were going to have these conversations like we're having now, and we have long talks, but I would think I would be the one to explain to him about kind of some of the stuff about our church and where we can, but he was already researched it all on his own. Like he's like, oh, yeah, Kent
Right.
McKean and this and that. And then
Right.
the this article and this persecution. And like, he's already read all the Wikipedia stuff about the
Right.
ICOC, and he knows all the debates. And, he's already like,
Yeah.
so it's like a different dynamic to our relationships. Now he's more like asking me, what do I think about this stuff that he's already researched and already knows everything about. The
Right.
other two kids
Yeah.
aren't as into that stuff as he is, but it is different.
It is. Yeah. That's such a good point. I think if I could like, I don't know, like if I could wave a magic wand and have my generation be better at something, it
Mhm.
would probably be like getting advice from elders. I'm not saying that we don't, but I'm saying it is hard when you see, you're right, like you see all the information on your phone. You're like, why do I have to ask this other person? Because I think both, but then at the same time, if I could wave a magic wand for the older generation to be better at something, it would be to talk to the younger generation. And
Yeah.
I think there's things that we can learn about both. And I think for the younger, we have so much information that just floods us all the time, which I think is great. But I think also we need to remember that we need each other, and,
Yeah.
we need to, maybe we have all this new information that like our parents or our grandparents don't know. We need to walk with them. And like we need to still walk with them and see where that leads us versus, and then you have like the older generation and, looking at all the younger generation, all this information. And it's like, again, we don't want it to like scare them, but that's why we need to build these bridges and all this stuff. Cause I think it would be great if we like used the strengths of each generation and
Right.
like kind of came together with all that. Cause it is cool that we have so much information at our
Right.
fingertips, but it would be cool if we didn't see that as like a scary thing, but like more of a strength, and then just, I don't know, use that to further better conversations.
Yeah, totally.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's like going back to your question about how to not be afraid or how to process what's going on, and so I think again, it's what helps me is thinking about what is God doing in our world, and like
Right.
it has to be God that all these, I mean, societies and human technology and everything was kind of similar for a long time. I mean, like
Mhm.
thousands of years, it was kind of like about the same, you know what I mean? Like as far as all tech, and then all of a sudden there's all of this technology, like the last
Yeah.
couple hundred
Right.
years, and all of these huge cultural changes and huge world changes. And that to me, God is always like behind all that. If you look in the Bible,
Mhm.
it's like God
Right.
used these empires for a purpose,
Mhm.
and God used the Roman Empire for a purpose, and God used the time that Jesus was in, and the Roman roads, and Greek
Mm.
culture and Greek language, and God used all that. I mean, you wouldn't have had
Absolutely.
the church grow if you hadn't had all of that stuff. God used the
Yeah.
synagogue system and the diaspora and what happened to the Jews, and like all of that was part of God's plan. So I think it's the same now. Like God is behind the internet. God is behind smartphones. God is behind. These are not the enemy. It's how
Mm.
do we? It's the enemy wants to use them. Satan wants to
Mhm.
use those things, just like Satan used the power structures. Satan used the Roman Empire. Satan used, but we're in this cosmic battle, and so we got to go. What is like? How would the Apostle Paul use Instagram? How would the Apostle Paul use a
Mhm.
smartphone? How would the apostle use all this? Apostle Paul use all of human knowledge that's available
Right.
at our fingertips now.
Yeah.
Like what is God doing, and how can we be a part of it? So that's, I love what like
Yeah.
Kidogo is doing, they're just like bravely going into that space. Let's talk about LGBTQ. Let's talk about like how,
Mhm.
baptism. Let's like, they're just, whereas I think people my age were a little more afraid of the internet, afraid of knowledge
Mm.
everywhere, because there was the ability for a time to kind of control. I don't want people to hear that because they might
Right.
not know how to process it, and
Mm.
that could be controlled. That can't be controlled anymore, so it's like
Mhm.
we have to go, how do we, so how do I'm going to assume you have access to all human knowledge, so how do we process all human knowledge?
Right.
It's a very different thing that's unique in human society, and that can be really scary, but it's also really exciting. Like this is a
Mhm.
really cool time we're in. Like we're in a time
Yeah.
that's unlike any in human history, and it comes with
Yeah.
huge challenges, global
Right.
warming.
Right.
um there's all kinds of things with globalism that are good and that are scary or that are difficult, but it's a
Right.
really cool time to be a Christian
Mhm.
and to be a part of the
Yeah.
kingdom of God, and what God's
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah. I'm curious what your personal journey is with like I mean, you again, you mentioned that you have long talks with, people of our generation, and what are things that you've learned? What are things that you've observed that you're like, I don't know, about kind of our generation of Kingdom Kid, and I guess how does it help you to talk to us? And is there anything that you've learned from people of our generation? I know that's kind of a general question, but
Yeah. Well, there's so much. I mean, I think, talking to my kids, being at Pepperdine uh,
right,
for 5 years in classes with students. And I think, the things that were like, there's things I really appreciate. I think there's a real desire to make a difference. There's a real value for, I think if I'm thinking about the ICOC, I love Hope Worldwide, and I'm grateful for Hope Worldwide. I still think it's always been a little weakness of us, or not a little, but I mean like a big weakness of us. The Jesus' ministry was preaching the word, but healing the sick, and the compassion side of helping alleviate human suffering. And I see in the young people a huge, like, I think maybe through all the Hope Youth Corps and through, but just even not in the church, there's a real desire to like help ease human suffering. Whereas I think the older people, the people, especially even the generation before me, there was more of a salvation, like a personal salvation side of the gospel. Like, let's just get people saved, and then like that's much more important. Whereas, and there's,
right,
those are big conversations about, well, what's the balance, and I like what Tim Keller says about the balance. He has a great book called Center Church that's kind of all about kind of maintaining that balance. It's not all just individual salvation. It's not just like social gospel or
mm,
it's got to be both. But I
right,
really see in young people the social gospel part, the like, let's do something about injustice. Let's do something about
hmm, for sure,
creation care. Let's do something about homelessness. Let's do something about poverty. Like
yeah,
I think that's super important. And I value that. And I'm inspired by the young people with that, and
yeah,
I think I've also learned about, I think there's more of a like focus on, I think doctrine is important, but I think in previous generations, there's been over focus on doctrine. I think especially like in the
mm,
hundreds of years ago, it was like, I mean, it was like people would kill each other over doctrine. I mean, that's crazy,
yeah,
like literally kill each other because of what they thought about baptism. Like, can you imagine that? Like,
right,
people were killing each other over doctrine.
yeah,
That's nuts. But
right,
but I think certainly, when I was in college, we had I mean, that was the battleground, was doctrine stuff. Like, people
yeah,
always wanted to argue baptism and argue about this and argue about that. But I think younger people, they don't care about doctrine as much. It's more
yeah,
uh of kind of who you are and how you're living, and there's more of an appreciation of discipleship and being like Jesus. And so I think I've learned, I appreciate that about
mm,
younger people. I think that
yeah,
has changed. I think there's a real um ethic for tolerance, the right kind of tolerance, and compassion, and caring about people who are different, and caring about the marginalized,
hmm,
caring about people who are, hearing the voice of the other, right? Not just being dug in
right,
your own worldview, but like, what is life like from their worldview? And there's a real appreciation
mm,
for that. So
yeah,
I really value all of that. I think along with that can come maybe um hesitancy to kind of plant your flag somewhere, or like go, well, I think we do need to stand for this. Like, we can't flex on this, because
mm,
the only thing worse than being, I mean, the worst, everybody's tolerant of everything except intolerance. Like, the worst thing you could be is like intolerant, in our culture, like now. And so
mm,
if you are seen as like having a stand, or kind of excluding someone, oh my gosh, that's the worst thing you could ever do. So I think, but Jesus did, right? He did take stands. He did exclude people, or he did say he was exclusive in some ways, but
right,
he reached out to the marginalized, but then he also said, here, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's an exclusive statement.
yeah,
So you
Yeah.
know, so that's something we got to figure out, that tension of, but again, I think Jesus is the answer, you know, and it
Yeah.
depends on the audience. You know, Jesus dealt
Yeah.
really differently with Nicodemus. He's like pretty harsh, you know, like, hey, you're Israel's
Yeah.
teacher. You don't know this, you know, like that's pretty disrespectful to a guy of Nicodemus's stature. Like this is the
Right.
top guy in his society.
Absolutely.
But then the woman caught in adultery, he's like, I don't condemn you, leave your life of sin. He has compassion. So I think we might have to speak with different messages to different people. But
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's really good. I feel like you hit our generation like on the head. Like, yeah, you got it. Yeah, that's so encouraging even to hear. I'm trying to figure out how to even phrase this next question because I'm curious, and this wasn't on the list. I'm just literally listening and curious about even because you're talking about even like social media and social justice and things like that, and how you see our generation kind of dealing with all those things. And then you have somebody on your staff, Megan, who runs Lifeline LA, and has started that even before Space Makers. And I know that she's posted things or done things that have made some leaders not so happy, which Megan can attest to. Um, and I don't know, it's interesting because I mean the things that she posts can kind of be controversial. I don't think that's a secret. Because she just posts some current stuff, and if you're not familiar with Lifeline LA, go check it out. And so I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are on even just the fact that you are including her on your team, you know, because I think a lot of people would be scared of like, oh, this person posting stuff on social media about church and like that's so scary or
yeah.
I don't know. So I guess what's your attitude towards that? And obviously Megan, feel free to chime in as well, because that question is about you.
Yeah, you know, I honestly, I'm just more of a listener and learner right now with that stuff because I don't know how to wrestle with difficult issues in the digital space. We just, my generation hasn't done that, and I haven't seen
Right.
great success with. I mean, I don't mean it can't be done. I appreciate younger. I mean, the way that my daughter communicates with her friends is so different than the way that I communicate with my friends. She's just
Right.
constantly sending little videos, you know, whatever we're doing, it's just like, you know, and then she just sent a video, like, you know what I mean? Like it's an ongoing conversation all day long with each of her friends that is
Yeah.
videos of whatever she's doing on Snapchat.
Yeah.
I have never sent, I mean, I send stuff to her like that just to be silly, but I can't imagine. That's just not the way that I grew up. I'm too old. I try to learn social media, and then I
Right.
get kind of spun a little bit sometimes by, I mean, I actually took a break from Facebook for a while, just because it was like too much and I just needed a break. So
Makes
I'm just
sense.
about to kind of get back onto it, but I can get too into like, how is this performing, or are people seeing it or not, or whatever. And then they've changed the algorithm on Facebook. It's kind of funny. So like I'll post something. So I maxed out the friends because people know me for my music and stuff. So there's a lot of people. So I used to post something and it would get like 500 people would see it. But now I post something and like 5 people will see it, you know, like, because
Yeah.
they've changed the algorithm.
Algorithms are weird.
Yeah. So then I'm like, why am I bothering if only 5 people saw it? Or I don't know, like if especially if it's something I feel like is important. And so I don't know. I want to learn from you guys with that stuff. Like with the world of how do we wrestle with tough issues in the digital space? Like I don't
Right.
know how to do that. So I've been really kind of quiet on social media with big issues. It's like I'm just posting flowers I saw on my walk. You know what I mean?
Nice.
I
Also
might put
important
a
stuff.
song, like there's a song I wrote called Spark Becomes a Fire that's really about kind of the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter and that kind of stuff. But the challenge, especially when you're a minister, is that people think you're being political. Like if I talk about Black Lives
Right.
Matter, I mean Black Lives Matter. Like there are people of color who've had an experience that is different than my experience, and they have had this feeling that their lives don't matter, and so I want to understand that. I want to listen to that. But somebody, if I use the term, like I used the term Black Lives Matter, this is before even this last summer, and this is when we were still all together, and I just, but people go, well, that you're talking about that organization, and have you looked at their website and what they stand for, and they're anti-nuclear family, and they're this and they're that, and they're pro that. It's like, that's not what I'm talking about when I use that. So I have to like stay away from certain terms because people are so politically divided, and especially during COVID when they're not seeing each other, they just get into their own little echo chambers of what they're listening to. And so my job, I mean, it was exhausting because my job all last summer was just all this conversation with people that didn't feel like listened to. And so I'm the one that listens to everybody, you know, both sides of whatever it is.
Right.
And it was pretty exhausting. And now that we're kind of back in person, like if you have somebody that, like, we have people in our church who are extreme right wing, and we have people in our church that, you know, really lean left, but when, and so on social media, those people, like, their dialogue can be horrible, but in person, it's like you see each other, it's like, oh, I like that person, oh, I like that person, and then you know, a lot of that kind of goes away. So anyway, the long answer is I feel like I'm just still listening and learning in that space. I don't know how to do it, and I want to learn, you know, and I'm open to suggestions. I mean, one thing that was hard to hear sometimes was like, if you're silent, you're part of the problem. You know, that was hard for me because it's like, well, I don't want to be silent, but I don't know exactly how to say it right. You know, like I you know, and so everybody's posting this certain thing because it's kind of trendy. I agree with it, but then if I post it, people think I'm being political, and so then I don't want, so then I just that's why I've just stuck to songs and flowers and
being a minister, you're definitely in a tough spot with all that. But
yeah, I think if I wasn't in the ministry, I could probably be like, I'm just gonna say what I think and who cares,
right?
You know? But I just, but people, if it has this extra weight of the church is saying this, and it's like, no, the church isn't. That's me personally saying it, but people don't make that distinction. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I appreciate what you said about like that you just want to listen because, you know, that's not how, this isn't how you grew up, and it's kind of new to your generation, whereas we like grew up doing it. Because that's so interesting. Because even, I mean, we've been trying to figure out how to do like a social media episode for the podcast. And the funny thing about that is every podcast that we do, we want to have like experts or, you know, people and listen to their experiences, and usually older people, so we can bridge that generational gap. But then we're like, what?
No, you guys are the social media experts.
Right.
Yeah.
So, because we're like, what older people should we ask questions to when
right.
they don't know either?
Yeah. And there'll be, I mean, you can say we just shouldn't be political online, or we shouldn't talk about spiritual issues online, or, you know, but is that true? Like, I don't, that's a solution, right? If we all do what I'm doing and just do flowers and, you know, scriptures and just try to keep it shallow and try to keep, and maybe that's what we need to do. Like, I think there is a difference in wrestling with something in person because there, you know, there's an anonymity that people hide behind sometimes online. And so they say things that they would never say in person. And so like in our Bible talk, for example, we've had some really great conversations about, you know, race and culture and difficult. We went through this Michael Burns book and some of the questions and people who are really needed to hear each other, but it's on Zoom. It would have been better probably in person, but we couldn't have done that on social media, you know, but I'm not authorized to say you can't solve these problems on social media. I don't know that, you know, like I'm too much of an infant in that arena, and you guys are more the experts. So, you know, and maybe you've had some success. I don't know, you know, like I'm not there, you know. Like my kids know how to, like my daughter had this conflict with another girl, it's her age, and they settled it over text. I can't do that. Like text is not a good way to settle, especially a relational conflict. Like I have to get on the phone. We have to talk it through but she handled it over text. I was like, okay,
Yeah.
amen.
Right.
You guys are able to do that, I guess, maybe with,
Yeah. Yeah. All right. All right, podcast listeners, you're here first. Brian Craig said we can do our own social media episode. We don't have to have a guest for it. Yeah, Meeks, you wanted to add something?
Sure. Yeah, I just love this conversation. And even I feel like it just ties back to what we were talking about earlier in the podcast. Like when we become fearful, it's really easy to reject culture. And it's really easy to be like, we don't know how to do this, so we're just going to not do it. And at this point, there's really no turning back.
right.
There's no like, we're going to get rid of cell phones and like, we're going to get rid of the internet and go back to,
Right.
pre-iPhone days. Like, I just really don't think that's ever going to happen unless a zombie apocalypse happens or something.
Right.
But so it's easy, I think, when we're fearful to be like, don't use these things. And like, I've heard so many times, don't use social media, and like just as a blanket statement. And obviously like we need to take things carefully and be wise and like what is best. And certain things are great for social media and other things are not great for social media. Just like text versus call, like, we have to use like different methods for different purposes.
Right.
But I really loved that point that you brought up earlier. And I think it just ties back perfectly that that's kind of what we're facing is, do we embrace this and do we really lean into it and start trying to think of how God could use it and what he might be trying to do? Or are we just going to reject it altogether and just label it as, unhelpful?
Right.
So I just think that that's super interesting and something that we're all learning, this is so new for all, like, even though we've grown up in it, like just the heightened momentum with social issues just in the past like 3 or 4 years is new to all of us.
Yeah.
So I just think we all just need to have grace with each other. And we can't expect everybody to like, kind of like how the parts of the body, like each part serves its own purposes. Like not everybody can be on the front lines of social justice issues. Like would that be awesome? Yeah. But is that realistic? No. And we also need balance. Like we need the people that are also going to be the ministers, like that are helping people with their emotions, and the therapists. And then we need the people who are just really positive, like they're not critical thinkers and they're just really positive and they want to give you a good word.
Right.
We need all of those people to have the most comprehensive and dynamic body. Because if everybody looks exactly the same, that's really not church,
Absolutely.
But I think when there's imbalance, that's when people start screaming for a need,
right.
And I think there has been such a lack of the social gospel. Maybe that's an overgeneralization, but at least within the past like 20 years, probably. So now it's like, okay, we need to catch up, if that makes sense. And that's probably why a lot of us are so passionate, is because we feel the need to like undo like make it balanced again. I don't know. So those were just my thoughts. But I'm really
that's
grateful.
really good. I mean, I think you said two things that were really wise and you could really build off of. I think the second thing was the diversity of the body. And I totally agree with you that we need diversity in the body. I know Gordon mentioned that on the podcast you had with him, but I think, God chose, even Jesus had a really diverse team. Like he had a tax collector you have given up on your Jewishness and you're saying, I'm in line with Romans and I'm stealing from my own countrymen. I'm that much in line with the Romans. And then he had a zealot, and zealots are like, we need to overthrow the Roman Empire. We hate Romans. We'll kill them if we can. Like that is the opposites. I mean, that's like, I don't even want to give you an example. I don't know what that is today, but that's the opposites of the spectrum. And I mentioned Antioch. I mean, it was a really diverse place. Like Antioch was this kind of meeting ground of all these like kind of cultural things, and God used that diversity. And I feel like God has used diversity in our churches. Like it's really unique that we have more churches outside the US than in the US. And we have a diversity of voices and cultures, and that it's so awesome. Like we need to celebrate that. We need to lean into that, and we need each other. And we just finished a series on called Reading Romans Backwards, where we were really looking at the church in Rome and these like real cultural differences that you see, and especially in the end of Romans 14 through 16. And everything else in Romans is really about that framework. And I really loved it, because I think we've all read Romans a whole bunch of times, but by the time we get to the end, we're not even thinking about, it's kind of a long book. And so by the time you get to 14 through 16, you're already like, what am I going to read next after Romans? But I think like, if you start there, it's like you really wait, this is why Paul said all this other stuff to this church he'd never even been to, was because of these cultural issues and needing each other, needing to listen to each other. And so when in Romans 12, where he's talking about the diverse body, and none of you considering yourself more highly than you ought, but with sober judgment, and you need each other, and you're the body. And all of that is because of the culture that we're in. So I totally agree with you. Like we really need each other. The young need the old, the old need the young, the rich need the poor need the rich. I mean, we all need each other. And then the first thing you said about cultural, like not being afraid of the culture and leaning into the culture. I think, I know Gordon mentioned 1 Corinthians 9 about being all things to all men. I would just add to the conversation Acts 17. I think is such a great example of Paul interacting with the culture, like, so because he's in Athens. It's amazing because he speaks to them in Acts 17, and he uses their own poets, like he uses their own philosophers, he uses their own language. He doesn't quote the Bible, he quotes their cultural references to make his point. And so that's like us, quoting whoever using lyrics from whoever the latest artist is, or who are the voices that our culture is listening to, like using those voices to, but then he really pointed people to Jesus, and he wasn't judgmental. He's like, I mean, think about Paul. He's a Jew of Jews. Like idolatry is the worst thing, to a Jew. Like there's no worse thing than I mean, if you read the prophets, like there's nothing worse than idolatry and injustice. That's what all the prophets are about, idolatry and injustice. But Paul doesn't even, he's like, hey, you guys are really religious. That's crazy. Like for a Pharisee to say, hey, I appreciate how religious you are. I mean, that is really like, he is really emptying himself there to have that this is their idolatry, for him to say, oh, you guys are really religious, I appreciate all these different gods you have, but I'm going to tell you, but then, so he's not judgmental, but then he points it to, here's the real God. And he doesn't hold back though either. He's not like, because I think our tendency is either we're judgmental and we alienate people, but we hold to the truth, or we're kind of like, we embrace the culture, but we're also kind of synchronistic. We kind of, we'll just like, we water down the truth, and we just kind of go, well, we just kind of try to take it all together, like coexist, like, but Paul doesn't do either. He completely embraces the culture, but then he says, like, I just pulled it up on my computer. He says, listen to this. He says, verse 29, therefore, since we are God's offering, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he appointed. He's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So, he doesn't water down the truth at all. I mean, he goes right to judgment day. There's going to be a day of judgment, and everybody's going to have to give an account. And God proved this by, and the resurrection. So I just think Paul's when it comes to engaging culture, I think Paul is a great model of, first he walked around, he looked at all of it. He like, okay, just observing the culture, taking it all in, learning the culture. He knows their prophets. He knows what's important to them. He knows their worldview. He speaks to that worldview, but then he directs it to Jesus and the resurrection and the one true God. And so I think that's what we have to do with whatever it is, if it's social media, or if it's LGBTQ rights, or if it's Black Lives Matter, or if it's, global warming, or whatever these important issues are. Like, we need to know them and not shrink from them, but then point people to Jesus and the resurrection and what God is doing in the world and his, his kingdom. So.
Right. Yeah, I love that. This is good stuff. It's funny how like just a conversation about generations and like different Kingdom Kid experiences opens up stuff about, truth and social media and like all the things that it brings up. So I love this type of conversation. But we definitely wanted to, I guess, to bring it in for a landing. If we have J. Brian Craig on here, we have to ask him a question about worship because
Okay.
how could we not? So I guess, since you're definitely so that's definitely your area of expertise. And we just wanted to ask, so for, me, my husband and I are worship leaders, so we have sung your songs many a
Awesome.
time. And I guess I wanted to ask, is there anything that you've learned recently, like in your journey, in your attitude towards musical worship? And what have you been learning recently? So take that question however you want.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. Gosh, I feel like I'm always learning. Speaking of culture, I think the way that we do worship, again, it's like there's God and there's Jesus and there's gathering around the table of fellowship and in communion and why we're together. But then the way and style and form that we're going to do that is always going to be changing and shifting. And if we like get too attached to one way of doing it, then I think then we become traditional, or then we become like we got to be open to changing. And so there's been a lot of change in my time in the church. I mean, I remember when it was a rule, if you're going to be up front, you had to have a coat and tie, and maybe some places it's still like that in the South or somewhere. But I mean, where we are in LA, it's like you look weird if you have a coat and tie, on a Sunday, like that's when people dress down, like that's the day to wear, your Hawaiian shirt and your khakis if you're in your flip flops or whatever. So, there's cultural changes. And so like, even my songs, I think sometimes people can think like, I think it should be a certain way. And I don't, I'm totally open, and I've changed my styles and my songs and kind of what we're doing, through the years. And so sometimes people associate my music with a certain way of doing it. And I don't feel, I feel like I love when people take like there was a church, I think, I can't remember where it was. It's somewhere in Asia. I wish I could tell you exactly where, but they did this version of Be With Me, Lord, that's like this EDM
Love.
like K-pop version of Be With Me, Lord, that is so good. It's so amazing. I love it so much. But that song was written like, that was like an a cappella song because we didn't have instruments when we were doing it back in the day. So I love like a song changing and evolving and doing it in different ways. Like it's totally cool. So I think it's always important for every congregation to kind of go, what is our culture? Who are we trying to reach? Who are we as a group? And like what works for us? Because a lot of our churches are small, and so they can't do like this big conference worship. Like they've got to do, they got to do what works for them, and I think so back to the question of what you learned. I think during COVID we were doing some of those videos where you like have everybody do their part over their cell phone, and then I would edit it all together, and we probably made about 10 or 12 of those videos. And it was fun because it kind of was our group and our identity and stuff, but they're really, really labor intensive. I mean, at the beginning, it was taking me like 18 hours to make one of those. I think I got down to maybe being able to do one in like 8 hours or something, 8 or 10 hours, but that's a lot of work for one song,
Yeah.
So we started doing here in my garage, we kind of set it up as those lights aren't on, there's lights up there, but we kind of set it up as this, like almost like a TV studio. And so we would have the worship team over here and just do a live stream. So all of our worship was live in this space with like 3 people or 4 people. And it was very different because I was so used to, so I came to worship ministry through like being a song leader in the teens or the campus, where you're just singing as loud as you can, like these happy clapper songs, and just, so I would sing very loud. And it's all about hearing the congregation and leading the congregation through it. And I love all that, but I'm not like a performer. Like I didn't come to worship as from the performance space as much, more from the like song leader space. So during COVID, it's like, it's so alienating because it's just like me and my voice instead of hearing that there's no church voice. And so at first it was kind of disorienting, and I didn't like it at all because I don't really like hearing myself sing. But I learned to lean into it and learn to listen and learn to play quieter and sing quieter. Cause I sing so loud that I can kind of be a little pitchy, but it doesn't matter when you're just leading this big congregation. Right. But I learned to kind of sing. So, and a lot of modern music sings very, very, very soft, like, what's her name that, with the green hair?
Billie
Billie
Eilish. I thought
Eilish. Yeah,
that's
she
what you
sings
were
super soft, right? Very, very soft. And amazing. But so I learned to kind of be okay with being soft and singing soft and playing my guitar really soft and more nuanced, and trying to have a different approach to worship, and I learned also that we could have really powerful, meaningful, and deep worship with we started having like a Bible talk at a time in the alley. So this garage door opens up so we could have people be outside and socially distance and stuff. So we would have a Bible talk come and kind of be our audience. And we had such great worship with just like 3 people and a Bible talk of 10. And it was like a really deep and meaningful worship experience. So it showed me that you can have awesome worship with like a really small group. It doesn't have to be, 500 people and 12 people on stage and all this technology. So that made me like kind of excited for our churches that are smaller, or, you know what I mean? So,
I love that.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
I love that so much. It's so funny that I feel like what you're saying about worship is like kind of the same message about what we were saying about everything else. It's just like, when the culture changes or when situations change, sometimes in adapting to what is the need of the time, you find out that like your roadblocks were actually like blessings that are going to lead to something cooler or greater or just different. So that's really cool and super encouraging. Is there anything else, I guess, Meigs or you guys, you want to say before we wrap up? Is there any closing thoughts or anything?
Well, I really, well, before I say this, on the worship side or the music side, another thing that I was learning or working on during COVID was other types of music. So I have, nobody knows about this because I probably need Megan's help with how to market this, but so I have this whole other kind of music that's not worship music, but I've always been into, which is like alternative rock and stuff like that. So I started releasing music, but I didn't want to release it under my name because people it's so different than like my worship songs. So it's under this band name called Ties to the Light. So if anybody is interested in that, like, it's funny because it has such little impact. Like I'll get this thing of from Spotify, and it's like my music. It's like you had 1,200 listeners, and then Ties to the Light is you had 9 listeners. So nobody knows about it, and I can't put it on Facebook. There's only 4 people that will see it now because of the algorithm. But
well, you'll get exposure from Space Makers listeners.
So I'll put that out there.
There you go.
Give it a listen. It's called Ties to the Light.
Plug.
But
of course.
But then I just wanted to say again, I really appreciate what you guys are doing. I appreciate your posture of not trying to, say, hey, we're young and we have all the answers and everybody needs to listen to us, but we just want to have a conversation, right? And we just and even inviting older people to your podcast and wanting to hear from us and modeling that, I think I think that's great. I really do hope that the older people are listening to you. It's encouraging that your demographic is some older people listening to your podcast. And I am telling people
Yeah.
to listen to it.
Yay, thanks.
So I appreciate, what you're doing. I really do agree with what Megan said. Like, we really need each other. We really need diversity in the church
Mhm.
and different voices and humility, and to hear each other out with humility. So
I love that. Thank you so much.
Yay.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for being
Megs,
here,
is there anything
Brian.
else? Yeah.
I just want to say
wanna add?
thanks. Thanks, Brian, for taking time. And I was literally so excited because when you came up to me at that staff meeting, I was like, oh my gosh, this could actually be so cool. And I've been pestering everybody, like, we need to figure out when Brian can be on our podcast, because I've been so excited. And it's just like really cool to hear from your life experiences. Because I think even for me, like, church history is so good to understand, but even just the fact that like you've gone through all these different stages, like to hear that the COC, the Church of Christ, was like not structured, I was like, hearing that, I was like, what? Like, I thought like organized religion has always been very structured. And so just to see kind of the waves of like, okay, so there was no structure, so people craved structure, and then now we have all the structure, now we're wanting no structure, and how that's just like the ebb and flow of humanity is just like this constant not strife, but like striving towards balance, and like really being attuned to what people need. It just gives me a lot of, what's the word, contentment, or just like trust, because I can feel like this has never happened before in history, and we're like, like there's so much. And in some ways that's true because it's different, but in other ways, like there's nothing new under the sun, and that doesn't minimize anything that anybody's going through, but at least it just gives me some perspective on just kind of what's going on. And so that like really helps just give me understanding, and that there's people like you that have just kind of seen it all, and you guys are still standing, and you're still, you still believe in God, and you're still just trying to live like Jesus. And I just love that. So I'm really grateful for your experiences and all of your life stuff, something that we could have never learned on the internet.
Amen.
So thank you.
Thanks for having me on and asking questions and listening to my very long answers that go all over the place.
You're good. It's good stuff. It's really good stuff. Thank you so much. And I love conversations like this. This is what we're trying to, kind of model to the listeners too, that like, we want to listen to each other and talk about the harder or the more controversial, whatever things. So this is very encouraging. I
Well,
appreciate
I'd be happy to come on again sometime if you want to drill down more on a particular topic, or, like just talk about worship, or just talk about parenting, or just talk about whatever it is. Happy to. I know we touched on a whole lot of stuff.
We did. This is a smorgasbord.
It really was, which is really funny because I feel like every single time we do this podcast, it's a different format and something different happens every time, which I love, keeping it fresh. So I'm excited.
Awesome. All right. Have a great day, you guys.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.
See you
Sunday. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.